I am particularly happy to return to Los Angeles, to return to UCLA at a moment when Ronald Reagan is having a lot of trouble with people like Ed Reiniger, who runs around saying he can't get a fair trial in Washington and wants to change of venue to California. But I want the organizers of the Black Women's Spring Forum to know that I especially appreciate their invitation to participate in this series of lectures, because it proves to Mr. Reagan and his co-conspirators on the Board of Regents that with all of the power they pretend to wield, they cannot succeed in subverting the will of the students here all the time, particularly if we're talking about a group of black women, determined, fighting black women who are aware of their responsibility to keep the fires of liberation raging. And I'd like to say, as an introduction to the remarks that I'm going to make, that I think this forum is immensely important. I think that we have a responsibility to research the contributions of our mothers and grandmothers, and we have the responsibility to continue to fulfill the legacy which has been left us by struggling women from among our people, understanding that without their contributions, our people would have never been able to withstand the savagery and the brutality inflicted upon us for so many hundreds of years. And so I think that we can say without the slightest hesitation that there has never been a single moment in the history of our people in this country when black women were not intensely involved in the resistance struggle. I want to continue what I was saying with a quote from a woman whose name is Dorothy Height. She's the president of the National Council of Negro Women. She says that to be black and a woman is to labor under the double handicap of racism and sexism. Historically, the black woman has carried this dual burden. She has had to work alongside the black man in a struggle unlike that of any other group in the United States. Hers has been a desperate effort to make a place of dignity for her people. Generations of black women have carried a disproportionate burden in the family as they are determined and were determined to keep its integrity intact against the constant onslaught of indignities to which it has been subjected. Not only have these women stood shoulder to shoulder with black men in every phase of the battle, but they have continued to stand even when their men have been destroyed by it. She's talking about Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth. But she's also talking about all of the anonymous black women who gave their lives through their participation in slave uprisings and revolts. She's talking about those women who met with repression which was far more severe than the repression inflicted upon black men, because the slave master understood that once black women became involved in the fight for the liberation of their people, then half the battle was won. And so what they often did during the slave era was, if a slave uprising which claimed the participation of women was put down, and they would decapitate the women and parade their heads on poles so that the other slave women could understand that this might be their fate if they got involved in struggle. This was one of the many ways in which they tried to frighten our great-grandmothers away from the fight for liberation. And we have to also recall that it was Rosa Parks who one day in Montgomery, Alabama, said with a loud, roaring no to the racists in Alabama that she refused to be treated as less than a human being any longer, and she refused to budge from her seat in the front of the bus. And it was in response to this gesture on the part of a black woman that the bus boycott led by Martin Luther King was launched. I think that we must never underestimate the contributions of women like Fannie Lou Hamer and Johnny Tillman, and a black woman communist by the name of Claudia Jones, who, because of her leadership to mass struggles in this country, was harassed, intimidated, and finally, because she was from the West Indies, deported by the U.S. government. And certainly none of us can forget the 4 young girls in Birmingham, Alabama, whose bodies were so viciously ripped apart by a racist bomb exploding in 16th Street Baptist Church as they attended Sunday school. And in the very same state, there was Sister Vivian Malone, who walked up to the University of Alabama to confront none other than the notorious George Wallace, who placed his body in the doorway in order to prevent her from entering the university. And by the way, in February, I went to the University of Alabama upon the invitation of the Black Student Union there. I must admit that I felt very triumphant to be able to speak to the students at that university in the very same auditorium, Foster Auditorium, where George Wallace stood in 1963. And then, of course, when we speak of the involvement of black women in the struggle, personally, I cannot forget that the movement around the demand for my freedom was largely organized and kept together by black women all over the country. I mean, I can talk about sisters like Charlene Mitchell and Kendra Alexander, sisters right here on this campus like Cheryl Dearman. But I also have to remember that there were black women who had not necessarily been involved in political struggles before, black women whose experience in organizing came from the church and from social clubs, black women who said no, they would not allow another one of their sisters to be swallowed up by the racist monster of repression. And when I speak of black women, I have to praise my own mother, not only for standing up steadfastly in front of all of the intimidation and harassment inflicted upon her, but taking a militant stance and becoming a leader in the struggle not only for my freedom, but in the struggle for the freedom of all political prisoners. And I have to talk about the mother of George and Jonathan Jackson, and the mother of Fleeta Drumgo, Inez Williams, who was still a leading figure in the fight back against repression. And when I reflect upon the long and infinitely rich history of struggle that has been written with the sweat and blood of black women, I have to place this tradition alongside the courageous deeds of other women of color. I have to remember Josefa, a Chicana woman, the first woman to be hanged in the state of California because she dared resist a white man who was attempting to rape her. And I have to recall that A sister by the name of Blue Whirlwind was one of the few survivors of the 1890 massacre at Wounded Knee. She received 14 bullet wounds, and both of her children were wounded. And of course, there is the heroine of the Puerto Rican decolonization struggle, Lolita Lebrón, because she dared to militantly expose and resist the colonial domination of her people in Puerto Rico. She was condemned to 50 years in prison. Today, 20 years after she went into the Congress of the United States of America with her 3 comrades, unfurled a Puerto Rican flag, screamed, "Viva Puerto Rico," and fired shots into the air. Today, 20 years later, she is still a prisoner of the government of the United States of America. After 20 long years in prison, she is speaking out on behalf not only of the struggle of her people in Puerto Rico, but on behalf of the freedom fights of all oppressed people. Though women of color undoubtedly have suffered the most barbarous forms of repression historically, this isn't to say that white women have not been exempt from the wrath of the oppressor. Now, I wonder how many of you know about Mother Jones, who organized miners, black, Chicano, white miners all over this country, who was arrested scores of times, shot, deported, held in custody by militia, banned from the state of Colorado, and yet she still relentlessly fought for better working conditions for men, women, and even children in those days. And moreover, I don't think that we can avoid seeing the fight of black women, the condition of black women, the contributions of black women, as being intimately related to the struggles of oppressed women throughout the world. And you know, one of the most moving experiences I ever had was a meeting with a 15-year-old Vietnamese sister by the name of Vo Thi Lien in Berlin last summer at the 10th World Festival of Youth and Students. I wonder how many of you know who Vo Thi Lien is? Has anybody ever heard her name? But she's somebody who ought to be a heroine for oppressed people everywhere. She was one of the few survivors of the My Lai massacre. At the age of 11, she had all of her family, all of her relatives, all of her friends. She saw them die under the bullets, the savage, murderous, racist bullets of people like William Calley, who is now walking free today. Yet this sister, 15 years old, who whenever she begins to talk about her experiences at My Lai, breaks down in tears. Still, she is fighting for her people, fighting for the freedom of political prisoners who are still being held by the Thieu regime in Saigon. And still, she wants to know about and expresses her solidarity with the struggles of black people in this country, of Chicanos, Asians, Indians, and working and poor people in general. And when we talk about women in other countries, we have to look up to women like Winnie Mandela, who has been held prisoner for many years, along with hundreds, perhaps thousands of other women who are victims of the forced apartheid regime in South Africa. And we have to look up to all of the women who are fighting and who are victims of oppression in Zimbabwe, in Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau. And there are women throughout the Middle East, Palestinian women struggling for their rights to their land. And women all over Latin America. And in particular, I would like to say something about the women of Chile. A few weeks ago, Hortensia Buse de Allende, the wife of the fallen president of the Popular Unity government of Chile, which was overthrown in a counter-revolutionary coup, which, and I don't think we have to speculate by this, has to be laid on the steps of the White House, the Pentagon, IT&T, Kennecott, and Anaconda, right here in this country. When she spoke before the Human Rights Commission at the UN some weeks ago, she said, and I quote, "I would like to devote a special paragraph to the women of my country who are today suffering the most humiliating and degrading oppression, held in jails, concentration camps, or in women's houses of detention, or the wives of the government ministers who, besides having their husbands imprisoned on Dawson Island, have had to spend long periods of time under house arrest, or the women members of parliament from the Unidad Popular who have had to seek asylum and have been denied safe conduct passes, such as Gladys Marin, Julieta Campuzano, Mireya Baltra. The most humble proletarian woman's husband has been fired from his job or is being persecuted, and she must wage a daily struggle for the survival of her family. This in itself constitutes an act of heroism and sacrifice, owing to the misery and hunger that the people of Chile are experiencing because of the country's disastrous economic situation as a result of the junta's measures. We have to militantly express our solidarity with struggling women throughout the world. And when we talk about the condition of black women in this country, let us look at it against the background of oppressed women everywhere. Now, to talk about some of the very concrete ways in which black women and third world women are oppressed in this society, all we have to do is look at the census report from 1970 to see that when you talk about Filipino women, you're talking about women who make a median income of $3,513. That is barely over the poverty level. When you talk about Puerto Rican women, you're talking about $2,938 a year. Chinese women, $2,686. Black women receive a median income of $2,041 a year. Chicana women, $1,929 a year. And then when you talk about Indian women, $1,697 a year. See, when you talk about oppression, you have to be able to localize it there where it's most concrete, where it's real. And all you have to do is look at these statistics. Moreover, one of the implications that we can draw from these statistics, and I don't think we have to speculate about the situation at all, is that there's a reason for this super exploitation of black women and women of color. And for one, they are an incredible source of profit, of extra profit for the capitalists. Literally billions of dollars over and above that which could be squeezed from the labor of white male workers are extracted from the labor performed by women of color. And let's try to concretize this even further. And let's dwell for a moment on the utilization of the labor of third world women, black women, as a source of these exorbitant profits. And when you look at Puerto Rican women who are concentrated in very large numbers in the garment industry in New York, they make between $65 and $100 a week. Mexican women on the other side of the border who work in those factories that all kinds of monopoly corporations build on the border make on the average of 40 cents an hour. 40 cents an hour. And then when we get down to the nitty-gritty, you want to talk about what most black women are forced to do in order to ensure the survival of their families, talk about domestic work. Because 43% of all domestic workers in this country are black. And you see, they perform a key role under capitalism. And we don't want to hear anything from Daniel Moynihan talking about any kind of black matriarchs, because we know that the reason why, well, first of all, the inhuman welfare system that forces black women to ask their men to leave so they can take care of their children, so their children will not starve to death, because so many states have these laws on the book where only fatherless families can get welfare aid. But then you consider the fact that unemployment is higher in the black community, in the ghettos, in the barrios, on the reservations than anywhere else in the country. So even when you do have a situation where a man and a woman are living together, often that man isn't even going to be able to find a job, so the woman is going to have to be the wage earner in the family. And so therefore, as a result of all of these forces, while 16% of white families headed by a woman were below the poverty level, 45% of third world families headed by a woman were below the official poverty line. I'm using statistics that come from the government, and I know that they attempt to underestimate and underplay the real conditions of our people. So when they say 45, we probably have to say at least 65, maybe more. The reason why I'm focusing on the plight of working women and poor women, third world women, is because these are the masses of women. As a member of the Communist Party, as a Marxist, I see working people as being the agents of revolution. And I see black working people, Chicano working people, Puerto Rican working people as being in the vanguard of that revolution. Sometimes, when I talk about the question of the working class, I've confronted situations where, black people, and most of them are non-working people, say, what's all that worker talk about? I don't want to hear anything about workers. I want to hear about black people. But 94% of black people are working people. And when you talk about the working class and the exploitation of the working class, you have to realize that black people are the first targets, the first victims, the worst victims of anything that a white worker is going to undergo. And that has always been the case throughout our history. The problem is that a lot of white workers don't understand that racism has historically been the most effective weapon, not only in order to ensure the super exploitation of black workers and workers of color, but in order to ensure to facilitate the exploitation of white workers. Because racism turns the head of the white worker towards the black worker as being his enemy, and he forgets that there's somebody up there in those corporation suites who has who has his foot on their heads and who's oppressing them. They forget about that. And when they forget about that, there's no way in the world they're going to talk about ameliorating their conditions at all. And that's why I think that in general, when you talk about struggles of working people in this country, it has to be recognized that the fight against racism is the central priority, and no white worker can ever attain any kind of consciousness of his condition unless he understands or she understands the need to participate in the fight against racism. And I say this also to the to women in the women's movement. As you know, for too long we've heard statements like the oppression of women is the oldest oppression that has been inflicted upon human beings by other human beings, and therefore the most important. And you have a situation where someone like, Robin Morgan can say that she has come to the conclusion that male supremacy, sexism, is the source of racism, and it is the source of imperialism. Well, anyway, let me move on to get back down to the nitty-gritty, to talk about our sisters. Let's talk about the need to support and stand beside all of our Chicano sisters who are farm workers. Dolores Huerta is a leading figure in the whole farm workers movement and has to be admired for her courage and her leadership. And to give you an idea of the conditions that third world women are forced to work under, let me read an article about a factory in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, where mostly black women work. Let me just read the whole article. As is their custom, women workers in the Carolina Narrow Fabric Company here in Winston-Salem held a baby shower for a sister worker on her last day on the job. And as usual, when the foreman said no presents would be allowed outside the bathroom, the women deposited them in the small toilet area before beginning work for the day. Then the pregnant woman and two friends came in. They tore off all the wrapping paper and placed the presents on display all over the room, working frantically to finish before the buzzer rang, indicating that they would have to be back at their machines. Throughout the day, the women who work at this non-unionized shop went to use the toilet. They saw and admired the shower gifts. The 400 or so women workers at Carolina Narrow make insulating tape for electric wires. I'm talking about black women. Listen to this. They have no lunch break, but are paid for 8 hours and must work straight through eating lunch at their machines as they work. During their 2 5-minute breaks during the day, 2 5-minute breaks, they are not allowed away from the machines. The foreman takes requests from snacks and brings them back to the floor. The bathroom, for lack of anything else, serves as the social center of the factory, where the women come early to crowd into the small room to talk and joke with each other. That's what you're talking about when you're talking about the oppression of black women. And to refer again to my home state, Alabama, there was recently a strike of stove and range workers at the Birmingham Stove and Range. Now, about 60% of the workers there are women, and practically all the women are black women. And you know, often when the oppression of women is alluded to, you hear comments about women being placed on a pedestal and not being allowed out of the home. This hasn't been the case with black women and third world women. We have had to work for the survival of our families for hundreds of years. And these women who went out on strike at the Birmingham Stove and Range, they do the very same heavy industrial work that men do. They handle hot, molten iron. And they make, when they start, they make $2.10 an hour. And no matter how long they work, they can never make over $2.30 an hour. And then we can take it a little bit further and talk about repression of black women on the job. And let me refer you to the case of a black woman from Detroit, an auto worker, who about a year ago became the target of a white male racist who launched verbal assaults at her, and who finally decided that he was going to try to physically harm her. And being the driver of a high-low truck, you know what a high-low truck is? Those crane-like trucks that you drive around in factories where they have, you know, something that goes up and comes down. What's it called? A fork? Yeah, a forklift, right. They call it high-low truck, too. I'll accept that as a criticism. Maybe I'll look for a job in a factory next year. But in any event, this sister was pinned against the wall by this white man driving this forklift. And when she resisted, like Josefa resisted, like Rosa Parks resisted and ended up doing all that time in prison. When she resisted, he went to the boss and filed a complaint against her. She was fired from the job. And when he went to the police, he was able to get a complaint against her for attempted assault. And for a whole year, the sister was all embroiled in all those legal hassles that she had to deal with. And finally, a few weeks ago, the trial took place. She was tried by an all-white jury. The sister was convicted of attempted assault of this white male racist who had been harassing her for many, many months. And so, fortunately, the judge presiding over the case was black. Hey, wait a minute, wait a minute. Let me tell you what he did first, because just the fact that he's black don't mean that he was going to do nothing. This black judge, fortunately, who understood what his role in the judicial system had to be, made a statement during the sentencing that this was the grossest miscarriage of justice he had ever experienced in his many years on the bench. So while he was forced to sentence her, he said that he was going to sentence her to 5 minutes on probation. But see, you know, while we applaud his action, let us not forget all of those sisters who do not have the fortune to go before a black judge. You know, I can't forget, for example, the sister who was in the cell next to me in the New York House of Detention. She had been charged with murder, although there was no evidence whatever to involve in the particular killing that had taken place. She had been in the New York Women's House of Detention for 18 months when I got there. And while I was there, the co-defendant confessed and said she had nothing to do with it. And so one day she went to court. She packed up all of her stuff. She said goodbye. We had a party for her, and she was going to walk. She was going to be out on the street for the first time in 18 months. And that evening she came back and said that the DA decided that the only way he was going to let her go free would be if she pled guilty to attempted assault, and he would credit her with time served. And she took the position she hadn't had anything to do with that killing, that she was innocent, and she was not going to cop a plea, as so many of our people have been forced to do by this racist, corrupt judicial system. And so this sister was still in that cell when I left. And I don't know how much longer she had to spend before she even had a chance to stand trial. And she knew she was going to be let off because the co-defendant was going to testify that she didn't have anything to do with it. But see, what happened was the DA was afraid that if she got out, she would file charges against him for false arrest and for holding her for practically 2 years on no evidence. But hey, let's move on to another area, and I want to also preface this with criticism of large sectors of the women's movement for not being cognizant of the most pressing problems confronting the most oppressed women in the society. And I see that there's some white women leaving. I hope that you all will listen to this, because I think it's very important. And I'm not saying this simply in order to come down on you. The reason I'm saying this is because I think it's important for you to understand what the nature of your movement has to be. And what I want to speak about now is the fact that a number of years ago, there was this whole abortion campaign. And I remember I was asked to support the abortion campaign. I remember a lot of black women and third world women were also asked to support this abortion campaign. And the position that many of us took was that, yes, we agree that women have the right to control their bodies. But there is also the question of sterilization, which is a way of preventing women from exercising control over their bodies. And if you're going to talk about raising the banner for the right to abortion, you have to talk about raising the banner for the right to bear life and not be forced to submit to involuntary sterilization. And I remember a number of years ago that a lot of women said, well, that sounds like rhetoric to me. I don't know about any kind of widespread sterilization. I think that you're exaggerating the situation, I was told. And I remembered a discussion I had with some French people when I was in Europe, when I asked them what they did when Jews were being carted away to concentration and extermination camps. And they said, well, we thought they were exaggerating. We heard about concentration camps and things like that, but it sounded too much like a nightmare for us to even believe it. And then, of course, by the time they were able to see the results of that vicious genocidal campaign, it was too late, because millions of Jews and communists and trade unionists and everybody who was opposed to Hitler, they were already dead. You know, you talk about the Nazis in Germany, and you have to remember that they did a lot of those experiments to perfect sterilization measures in order to purify the Aryan race. And in fact, these very same techniques are being used on such an extensive scale in a place like Puerto Rico that now, 5 years ago at least, 10% of all women between the ages of 15 and 45 have been sterilized. And the figures have probably are mounted during the last 5 years, so they're probably even more. And we don't even have to go to Puerto Rico. We can look at the situation right here. Carl Schultz from the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare recently gave an interview to a reporter which I read in the San Francisco Chronicle. And he was told that somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 women had probably been sterilized last year with HEW funds. And I think that we can be virtually certain that the majority of these women were black and brown. Of course, this whole issue of sterilization was rather dramatically brought to light last year by the revelation that two sisters, the Ruff sisters in Montgomery, Alabama, had been sterilized after their parents were deceived into signing the papers. And you know that they were sterilized with funds that were provided by the federal government through the poverty programs. And then we look at a state like North Carolina. According to the official figures which you may get from the government of the state of North Carolina, between the years of 1960 and 1968, 1,623 people were sterilized, 1,583 of which were women, and about 1,020 of which were black women. Over half of all of these women were under the age of 20. And there is a case in the courts at this very moment which was filed by a sister named Elaine Trent. She is now 19 years old. She was married last year and decided she wanted to have a family, and discovered that an operation which she received 4 years prior to that, at age 14, had permanently sterilized her without her knowledge. But you see, let me ask you a question. Is it any wonder that this kind of savagery is being inflicted upon black women when you have savage people like William Shockley gallivanting around the country wearing the garb of academia, being supported by a whole lot of these liberal white professors spouting off their theories, pseudoscientific theories of the inferiority, genetic, hereditary inferiority of black people. And let me just read to you an excerpt from some remarks he made on Black Journal not long ago. Listen to this very carefully. In the black community, he says, the birth rate is very high at the bottom end. See, he uses all of this funny sounding language so you don't know what when he's talking about the bottom end, he's talking about the masses of black people, working people, poor people, welfare women, unemployed people. It is well known throughout the world, he says, that where there are high birth rates in localized populations, they are almost inevitably associated with poor economic situations. I mean, he says it. So that if the black community is, as I see it, suffering as a whole from the very high birth rates of its least effective elements, then a means of helping to stop this by voluntary bonuses, which would give an annuity to the people involved. This might be a kindness to the people involved. It might be a kindness. And you know, what he refers to next is that program that was set up in India, where people who submitted to sterilization operations received transistor radios in exchange. Has he been to this campus yet? When did he come? I hope y'all didn't let him speak. Because see, you know, they talk about freedom of speech and freedom of assembly and freedom, academic freedom. And see, they try to play with your minds because they want you to forget that there ain't no sense in all in having those freedoms unless they are utilized to enlarge freedom and not genocide. I mean, that's a contradiction for someone to have the freedom to advocate the genocide of a people. And I wonder, see, I think the next time you're confronted with a situation like that where you have these liberals saying, well, you know, we have to let him speak because he is a citizen of this country and he does have the right to freedom of speech. Ask them whether if they had lived in Germany prior to the seizure of power by Adolf Hitler, whether they would have stood up for the right of some Nazi doctor to advocate the genocide of Jews.